Good morning.
Morning.
That was a little better. You happy to be worshiping God?
Yes.
Well, that's great. We want to spread the word all we can. Today, we want to look at the question of why God allows Christians to have problems. I'm not sure I'll finish this, but we're at least going to start it. I want to tell you a story that we started in the bulletin. It was about a couple of pheasant hunters. We used to live in Nebraska. There were a lot of pheasant hunters. But these two pheasant hunters were out hunting, and one of them was on one side of the fence, and I guess the other on the other. And this one, he came up to a big hole in the ground right in the path, and you just stopped short and looked down it. He said, "Come over here and look at this. I can't believe it." And the other one climbed over the fence, and they looked down at the path, and there was a 3-foot hole. And they couldn't see the bottom, and one said, "Well, let's find out how deep it is. We'll get a pebble or something, throw down, and listen to it." So they threw this pebble down, and they never heard a thing. They said, "Well, let's get something bigger." And they got a big rock, maybe the size of a bowling ball. And they threw it down in there, and it went crashing down, hitting each side. But they never heard it hit bottom either. And they said, well, one of them said, "Well, I'll fix this." He went and grabbed this cross tie that was laying there, and he shoved it into that hole, and it went banging down that hole, and all of a sudden, here came this white goat and just went straight down that hole, just running full blast. And they said, that's crazy. About that time, a farmer showed up, and he said, "Have you seen my white goat?" And they said, "Yeah, we saw a white goat a while ago. He came running here and ran straight down that hole." And the farmer said, "Well, it wasn't mine. I had him tied to a cross tie." Some of y'all got that. But as you think about it, that goat had a problem, didn't he? But we sometimes have problems. We can't always see the consequences of what will happen, and we don't always understand, why is this happening? Why would God allow this? And our problems can seem pretty bad sometimes, can't they? They can seem pretty harsh. Now, God hasn't revealed everything, such as all that we need to know about problems. But just think about it. Think of any Bible character you want to think. Do you find any who had no problems? I doubt you can think of a one. We usually have enough definition of things that happen to people to know they had problems in their lives at different points. So why does God allow these things? Why should he allow? We're going to start at 1 Peter 4, 12 and 13. And we need to realize that many times problems are exactly God's will for us. Why? You know, we have people out there telling people, you come to Jesus, you come to God, your problems are over. Is that the truth? It is not the truth. You know, this week I'm going to a specialist to find out about having a pacemaker put in. I hope that happens, and I hope it helps, because some people it doesn't help. But we have to deal with problems, don't we, in this life? They can be health problems, they can be other kind of problems. But in 1 Peter 4, Peter said, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding glory." Now he's talking in the context of persecution, but people have problems besides persecution, don't they? We're not to think that those things are strange. We're not to think that God said, you'll have no problems like people are being told out there. We're not to think those kinds of thoughts. A contemporary version of that verse says it this way: friends, when life gets really difficult, don't jump to the conclusion that God isn't on the job. Instead, be glad that you are in the very thick of it, of what Christ experienced. This is a spiritual refining process with glory just around the corner. Again, he's speaking in persecution terms, isn't he? But you look at the life of anyone, there are things that happened to them that had nothing to do with persecution. Troubles that came upon them that had nothing to do with persecution. Sometimes it is within the will of God to allow problems. He allowed Job to be attacked by the devil, didn't he? And we can study the book and learn some of the reasons. And we can learn what Job learned. But again, we are not to think that becoming a Christian means the end of problems. It is not that way. Nevertheless, God is greater than our problems, isn't he? God is able to use the problems that come upon us, even those that just happen because we're humans. You know, there are problems that God didn't bring them on. God never, ever does anything bad to us, period. God sometimes allows bad things, knowing we can grow, we can learn. Maybe our learning is just so 20 years from now we can help somebody that we never knew before. I mean, we can't see all of those things, can we? But they are a part of the will of God. Becoming a Christian, again, does not take away all our problems. And God's purpose is greater than our particular problems. What is God's purpose? In this message, we want to look at some of the ways that God uses problems. You remember the verse that says, God will not allow temptations to fall upon you, but that which you are able to bear. And we say, I can't bear it, stop it. God says, you are able, or he wouldn't have allowed it. It's hard to understand sometimes, isn't it? Number one, God uses problems to give us directions. Sounds strange, doesn't it? To use problems to give direction. In Proverbs 20 and verse 30, the writer says, blows that hurt cleanse away evil, as do stripes the inner depths of the heart. When everything's easy, we tend to ignore the bad things, don't we, in our world? But when things are difficult, we ponder. We try to learn from, we try to grow from the struggles that come upon us. One Bible says it this way: sometimes it takes a painful experience to make us change our ways. We probably all experience that at some point, or we will. Things happen that cause us to ponder our life. What it means to follow God, and why we are here. I want to mention a story by a preacher when he was a little boy, not myself. He's been dead 20 or 30 years now, about 20-something years. I only knew him by some of his writings that I had access with a particular program that used to be out that I was involved with. He said, when I was a little boy, I was enthralled by this embankment at the back of our house and went sharply down and onto a major highway where cars flying by at full speed, and my mom told me, don't you ever get over that fence. Don't you even get near that fence. But he said, every time I went to the backyard, what do you think I did? I headed to the fence. And I would maybe grab things through the fence. And one day I dropped one of my boots just over the fence, and then I couldn't reach it. I couldn't get a good hold of it. And my mama saw me through the kitchen window. She came out and she got me, and she wore me out. He said, I never went near that fence again. Though I played in the backyard, that painful experience taught me never to get near that fence. But the fence wasn't the problem, was it? It was the roadway down below it. We live in an area where fences often seem to be necessary for children, don't we? And it's the same kind of a thing. We learn from painful experiences, don't we? In his case, a spanking taught him never to get near that road or that fence again. Saul of Tarsus is another biblical character. He was a man that hated Christians. He went everywhere trying to destroy them, didn't he? And then one day, God knocked him to the ground. Not literally. But what God did is he blinded him and spoke to him and made him understand he was attacking his own son. That is God's son. And Saul had to be led by the hand. He was riding a horse, I suppose. I don't know how he was getting there. But he had to be led by the hand for several miles, I guess it was, maybe quite a number of miles, into the city where he was going. And when he got there was a Christian who showed up. And through this Christian preacher, Saul received his sight again and was convinced by all of these events that God wanted him to become a Christian. In fact, to become, though he didn't know it yet, and perhaps never knew it, the greatest Christian preacher of the first century. You know, God sent 12 apostles to a little tribe called Judah, because they were an obstinate group. And God sent one man to the whole rest of the world. Isn't that amazing? Saul of Tarsus, now usually known as Paul. Those problems for Paul caused him to reassess his belief in Jesus, didn't it? Those problems caused him to ponder what he had been doing. Blindness caused him to think about, I've been wrong. And for him to become a Christian, so effective at the very beginning, so effective that the Jews who were there could not deal with him. So the process began of taking the number one known Jew other than Gamaliel and trying to kill him. They tried that for many years, didn't they? And they never succeeded. So Paul had to endure beatings, attacks, lies, all kinds of things because of his faith that he had now accepted. God told a preacher in the Old Testament, you need a little background. There was a major enemy of the world in that day. This enemy didn't send a pandemic. This enemy attacked you And if you fought and you lived through the battle, they stuck a pole through your body and hung you up to die. Took a couple of weeks sometimes. Before they did that, they literally skinned you alive. Then they put you on that pole. Perhaps this preacher had had some of those things done to his own kinfolk. Certainly maybe to some of his parishioners. We would call him a prophet today. He was more than a preacher. His name was Jonah. And God said, Jonah, I want you to go east to Nineveh. Well, it was northeast. What did Jonah do? He got a ticket on a ship to Spain, as far to the west as possible at that time in history. But it didn't end well, did it? He got to take a submarine ride in the belly of a fish. And that fish carried him to the main path that led to Nineveh in the northeast Mediterranean Sea, and then spewed him out, vomited him onto the shore. And when he got up, he went to Nineveh, didn't he? That was a painful experience. Can you imagine the acids flowing over your body? That was a painful experience. Normally, you wouldn't live 3 days in the belly of a fish. You'd be absorbed by the acids. But it says God prepared a fish. In effect, God made that fish sick. He made that fish so that his acids were very weak. And Jonah could live 3 days there. Imagine trying to stay alive with fish in the belly of a fish. An awful thing to happen to you, right? But it had a good effect. Even in that part of the world today, there's still a statue at a graveside saying this is where Jonah was buried. Now I know there's 2 or 3 others. But it's more likely that that's where he was buried. He spent the rest of his life there, converting hundreds of thousands of people. The bad thing caused a great thing, didn't it? Now, we would call it bad, but in this case, it was disobedience to God that required a correction. And God did that, didn't he? Paul told the Corinthian church, "Now I rejoice, not that you were made sorry, but that your sorrow led to repentance. For you were made sorry in a godly manner, that you might suffer loss from us in nothing." So Paul says, I know this upsets you, my words. I know that you were very distressed. And I'm glad, not because I made you sorry, per se. I'm glad because what I said led to your repentance. That was 2 Corinthians 7:9. Repentance is a change of direction, isn't it? Followed by a change of mind. A good question to ask ourselves when bad things hit us. Where is this problem leading me? You know, problems seldom leave us where they found us. Sometimes we get worse in our life, don't we? We rebel. Sometimes we get better because it leads to repentance. Another one, problems test us. You know, someone said, people are like tea bags. You don't know what's in them till you drop them into hot water. Tea bags. Hot water comes upon us sometimes in the form of problems. In Deuteronomy 8 and verse 2, God told Israel, "And you shall remember the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to test you." One translation says to try you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep the commandments of God. So the key word here is to test. How long did it take to go from the border of Egypt to Canaan, walking with children and animals? A couple of weeks. But when they got there, they would not go in, and God made them spend the next 40 years almost in the wilderness, didn't he? Problems were to test them, to find out, are you going to cry to go back to Egypt, or are you going to obey me? Which is it going to be? 40 years later, they had all chosen. God saw to it they all died in the wilderness. Just the children, the young people, were allowed to enter. Those under 20. That's a sad condition, isn't it? To spend 40 years to get to go to Canaan and then say, you're not going in. You're all going to finish dying off here in the wilderness. Our text said again, "Beloved, do not think it a strange thing that this fiery trial, which is to try you, as though it were something strange had happened to you." God sometimes uses problems to inspect us, as he did the Israelites. James spoke about this in James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, where he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into manifold temptations." Wow. Knowing, or trials is the New King James wording for there, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. You know, there are many people who are untrained in many fields, right? If you want to talk about the field of the military, well, you get a beginning training and an ongoing training the whole time you're in there, right? Of some sort. If you want to talk about football, you get training and it's ongoing forever. If you want to, it doesn't matter what you talk about. If you want to talk about the Christian life, the training never ends. It goes on and on and on. In 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7, you know, we've already noted that he compared our trials to fire. Here it says, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while. If need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ." God uses problems to test us, to train us. Many times people, in any area you want to talk about, whether it's training in music of some sort, or 1,000 other things you could think about. Many times people are arrogant as if they already know, right? And they prove themselves to be foolish because they don't know. You know, training is not just taking training. Training, in the better sense, is going through something till you do it automatically. That's what Christianity is. We are to go through trials and things and continued trials and problems until our life, and on after this, until in our life we've learned to make these things a habit. to make the way of Christianity a habit. Trials come. What did Job say? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Well, there's a great man, isn't it? A man who had learned through many struggles, I'm sure. A man who had learned to walk in faith, to live in faith, no matter what kind of bad things happened, to keep his faith. We need to continue always to think about our faith. There are other problems we'll look at later that test us. But all of them have a purpose. We are to become a stronger person, aren't we? We're to become a more knowledgeable person. We're to become a more determined person. And you could just name quality after quality that struggles produce in us. I mentioned to you that in boxing training, you took this 30-pound bag and you would slam it into the stomach of the other guy. And then he would do the same thing to you. That doesn't sound too pleasant, does it? To have this bag, boom, thrust into your stomach and you have to stand there and take it. Over and over and over. Well, what good it builds that stomach muscle. That's especially that muscle over the heart. You don't want to get hit there and go down, do you? That's boxing. It's just one little area. Every area you want to talk about takes problems and struggles to develop, doesn't it? But we want to say, well, God wouldn't allow that. No. God allowed many things to his people, didn't he? Because God is not so concerned about something that happens to this body. Is what happens to what's inside this body. We call it the spirit, don't we? The spirit. In the old days, it was the word ghost. The spirit is what God will take and give a spiritual body eventually. But God will take that into heaven for eternity. That's what we seek. So often people seek the pleasures of this world. And in the end, they're going to lose their pleasure, aren't they? We're going to grow old. We've talked about this before. We grow old and then we die. Sounds bad, but we are still preparing for a better place. We're going to have an invitation. And if any of you need to respond in some way, or those of you who may listen online, you can write me at owentoncfc@gmail.com. And we will help you. So if you have any need of the invitation, won't you come now as we stand and sing? Of his word.